Hello everyone and welcome back to the space where we say that I can sleep. Happy start of September. Oh my goodness, it feels like 2024 literally just started last week or something. We are getting into fall and winter and pretty much the end of yet another year, so I hope you guys can look back on this year and say that you had a good year, made some good memories, and are ready to move forward into a new year. Now, as per usual, if you are enjoying these readings and would like for me to continue doing these readings, you can show your support by leaving me likes, leaving me comments, sharing my stuff. Please consider supporting the Patreon, and then follow my other platforms like Spotify at iKenSleep, YouTube at iKenWin, and TikTok and Instagram at officially.iKenWin. Now let us descend or ascend for the 45th time into Heaven Official's blessing. To compose in Nuit Blanche, fragrance added by red sleeves. This was a question to which Shilian already vaguely knew the answer, but Hua Cheng's reaction was not what he expected. After a brief silence, Hua Cheng blurted out, "I'm sorry." Shilian was puzzled. What? His first assumption was that if Thousand Lights Temple wasn't some kind of a joke, the individual most directly tied to the incident could only be Hua Cheng. But no matter how off the mark he might have been with this guess, there was no reason for Hua Cheng to apologize. Hua Cheng didn't respond, just gestured Shilian to keep walking with him. So Shilian followed his lead. They walked for a while, and after making a turn, the sight before him opened to a broad horizon. Before Shilian's eyes rose a temple that glowed with quiet transcendence. In an instant, his breath hitched. All around them, the colors of the ghost realm crisscrossed, smoky grays and vivid scarlets. Surrounded by such a backdrop stood that temple, majestic and splendid, its thousands of lights resplendent, as though this were paradise itself. A temple founded on such radiance and brilliance was out of place sitting within the rowdy, chaotic pandemonium of Ghost City. But it inspired all the same. The second that one laid eyes upon it, it left a deep, enduring impression. It took a long time before Shilin found his voice. This is... The pair stood before the temple, gazing at the structure with admiration. Hua Cheng raised his head slightly and explained. It was the Mid-Autumn Festival a few days ago, and I figured Gaga would probably join that rabble in their frivolous games. So I set this place up to provide Gaga with some amusement while attending the banquet, to make things interesting and relieve your boredom. Hua Cheng's approach to relieving boredom was much too sensational. For the sake of Shilian's amusement, he had built a temple and raised 3,000 blessings lanterns of everlasting light. Hua Cheng lowered his head, fixing his cuffs as he continued. I didn't want you to know, because I arranged all this without permission. Pray Gaga isn't offended that I built Gaga's temple in such an unruly place. Shilian immediately shook his head. It seemed Hua Cheng hadn't wanted to tell Shilian of it because he thought he was causing Shilian trouble. He really didn't know what to say. At this point, giving thanks again would fall flat. Thus, Shilian steadied himself, drew in a deep breath, and proceeded to admire this Thousand Lights temple with renewed care. A brief moment later, he tilted his head and asked, This temple? is a singularly beautiful work of architecture, and massive as well. The artistry and craftsmanship of its edifice is divine. It couldn't have been constructed in mere days. Sanlang, you didn't build this only recently, did you? Hua Cheng smiled. Of course not. Gaga has a good eye. This was built a long time ago. I never found a use for it, so I had it hidden away. No one has ever been allowed inside. I'll have to thank Gaga for finally giving it a purpose and allowing it to see the light of day. Shilin was surprisingly relieved to hear this. If it had been built a long time ago for some other reason, but never properly settled into a use, then it had only been adopted for convenience's sake. If Hua Cheng really had constructed a temple just for Shilian, he would feel even more uneasy. Of course, with Hua Cheng's personality, it could very well have been built solely to amuse himself. Although Shilian was quite curious as to why Hua Cheng would construct a building that so vastly differed from the rest of Ghost City, he contained the impulse to ask. It wasn't a good habit to pry, lest one accidentally ask what one shouldn't. Wanna go in and take a look? Hua Cheng asked. Of course, Shilian answered cheerfully. Side by side, they entered the temple, leisurely strolling down the jade stone path. The interior of the temple was spacious and bright, but it didn't have a divine statue, nor any cushions for worshippers to kneel upon. This was built in a hurry, so there are many careless and thoughtless elements, Hua Cheng explained. Pray Gaga forgives me. Shilin grinned. Not at all. I think this is very nice. Very, very nice. It's good that there isn't an idol or cushions, and best if there won't ever be. But how come there's no establishment plaque? He wasn't calling Hua Cheng on a fault. It was just that even the jade stones paving the temple paths were meticulously engraved. With Thousand Lights Temple, but the establishment plaque above the entrance was missing. Naturally, it couldn't have been a simple oversight, hence Shilian's curiosity. Hua Cheng chuckled. It can't be helped. There isn't really anyone around here who can write. Just think of that crowd earlier. It'd be impressive if they could even recognize letters. Does Gaga like any particular calligraphy masters? I'll invite them over and help compose the plaque. Although, in my opinion, the best solution would be for Gaga himself to draw up a sign and hang it over Thousand Lights Temple. That would be more than splendid. As he spoke, he pointed to the altar in the Great Hall. This jade altar temple was exceedingly long and wide, and various offerings and an incense burner were neatly placed upon it. There were even brushes, inkstones, and paper, providing an air of scholastic elegance. The pair approached the table, and Shilian asked, Why doesn't Sanlang compose one for me? Hua Cheng's eye slightly widened at the suggestion, like the thought was unexpected. Me? Yeah, Shilian replied. Hua Cheng pointed at himself. You really want me to write? Shilian noticed his discomfort and asked, Will it trouble Sanlang? Hua Cheng cocked an eyebrow and replied, No, it's just... Seeing that Shilian was waiting for him to answer, he clasped his hands behind his back and continued, somewhat helpless. Alright, it's just... I don't write well. Now this was something new. Shilian truly couldn't imagine there was anything Hua Cheng couldn't do well. He smiled. Oh, really? Will you write something and show me? Are you sure? Hua Chang asked once more. Shilian took out a few sheets of blank paper, laid them neatly upon the jade altar table, and attentively flattened them. He then picked a fine-looking Shihao brush made of brown rabbit fur and placed it in Hua Chang's hand. Come. As Shilian had prepared everything, Hua Chang relented. Fine, but don't laugh. Shilian nodded. Of course. Thus, Hua Chang took the brush and started writing, assuming a serious air. Shilian stood next to him and watched, but the more he watched, the more unreadable his face grew. Shilian genuinely wanted to hold it in, but he failed. As Hua Chang wreaked mad havoc on that paper, he chided Shilian half in warning and half in jest. Gaga. Shilian immediately schooled his expression. My bad. He didn't want to laugh, but what could he do? Hua Chang's writing was just too funny. Of all the crazed brushwork Shilian had ever witnessed, none could measure even halfway to Hua Chang's wild script. A wildness that carried a wicked whirlwind of malevolence. If any calligraphy teacher saw it, their eyes would roll back and they'd perish on the spot. After a long time, and with immense difficulty, Shilian managed to make out sea, water, peak, clouds, and other such words through the scrawl. He guessed Hua Chang must be writing. After seeing the vast sea, no water can compare. Scattered from the peak of Mount Wu, there are no other clouds. Hua Chang was master of the ghost realm and feared by all of heaven and hell. To think he was finally showing such a vulnerable side of himself because of something like writing. The thought alone was going to make Shilian's gut burst from holding in his laughter. Hua Chang completed the piece with a wave of his hand, and Shilian forcibly feigned calm as he picked up the end product using both of his own. Good. It's got such a personality, an essence all its own. It's got style. Hua Chang put down the brush, looking like he had the posture wholly perfected, and smiled with his eye in a crescent. Madness, you mean? Shilian pretended not to hear and began to offer commentary with a straight face. In fact, writing well is not difficult. What's difficult is writing with a unique style. If one's calligraphy only looks good in the same way that thousands of other works look good, then it's nothing more than common. Sanlang has a good foundation, the flair of a master, a daring spirit that conquers the world. There were two other idioms that followed. Broken land, armies in turmoil. It couldn't be helped. Fabricating praise was hard work. Hua Chang stood there, and the more he listened, the higher his brows raised. Really? He asked doubtfully. When have I ever lied to Sanlang? Shilian asked. Hua Chang calmly and languidly added a few incense blocks to the small golden vessel on the side, and in the midst of that fresh, faint fragrance, he continued with an air of nonchalance. I do want to write well, but there's no one to teach me, and I don't know if there are any tricks to the art. He had certainly asked the right person. Shilian hummed and replied, There's really no trick to it. Just... Shilian considered it, but in the end he felt he couldn't explain everything he wanted to with words alone. So he shuffled closer to pick up the brush himself and wrote the last two verses of the poem Hua Chang had started. It was done in one breath, and after staring at it for a moment, he sighed a rueful chuckle. How shameful. I haven't had much chance to write in many years, so I'm not as good anymore. Hua Cheng stared at the 4 verses that looked as vastly different as heaven and hell. The style of the characters foreign to each other, especially the last 2 verses that Shilian had added to finish the poem. Many times I've passed through the flowers, yet I spared them no glance, for half my fate is in cultivation, and the other half in you. He connected the verses together and read them a few times, his eye twinkling and unmoving from the page. It was a while before he looked up. Teach me? Well, I dare not lecture, Shilian said. Thus, he began to give Hua Cheng a detailed introduction to calligraphy without holding back, providing insights and all that he'd learned from practice in his younger years. They were surrounded by subtly perfumed air and brilliant lights. Within the great hall, their chatter was low, light, and leisurely. Shilian lectured earnestly, and Hua Cheng listened intently. It painted a soft picture. After a while, Shilian prompted him. Why don't you try again? Hua Cheng agreed obediently and took the brush from his hand to write another few characters, his expression serious. Shilian crossed his arms as he watched, tilting his head. Interesting, but he still felt there was something off about the way Hua Cheng put his brush to paper. He observed with a frown and suddenly realized where exactly it was going wrong. Hua Cheng wasn't holding the brush correctly to begin with. If even the way he held the brush was all over the place, of course it would come out strange. Shilian didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and stood closer, reaching out to correct him without thinking. You're holding it wrong. It's like this. Only after he reached out did he suddenly realize his actions might be inappropriate. He wasn't an elderly teacher tutoring a young disciple, so to instruct Hua Cheng by guiding his hand over might be overly familiar. However, since the hand was already out, there was no reason to pull back rashly. He'd only appear overly self-conscious. So, after some hesitation, Shilian didn't remove his hand. He remembered the gambler's den. Hadn't Hua Cheng taught him how to roll dice like this, hand on hand? Although Shilian felt he had learned absolutely nothing then, and even had a sneaking suspicion he'd been somehow deceived, here and now, he was sincere in his desire to teach Hua Cheng. Thus, Shilian's warm palm relaxed as it pressed close against Hua Cheng's cold hand. With a gentle hold, he led Hua Cheng's hand to guide the brush across the paper, whispering, Like this. He sensed Hua Cheng's brush growing wilder under his hand, so he pressed down a little more firmly to control and correct its path. It didn't take long before it veered further off course, resisting the control, so Shilian had to grasp tighter. The characters drawn through their power combined were crooked and twisted, unseemly and ugly, and the more Shilian guided, the more he felt something was off. Finally, he couldn't help but gape at the results. What? The ink on the paper had run tyrannically askew. As if this were a successful silly prank, Hua Cheng snickered softly, leaving Shilian exasperated. Sunlung, don't be like this. Learn properly. Write properly. Okay, Hua Cheng obediently acquiesced. It was blatantly obvious that he was only pretending to be serious. Shilian shook his head, feeling ridiculous. Hua Cheng's hand might have been cold, but for some reason, it felt like a lump of hot coal in his grasp. Shilian didn't dare hold him any tighter. His eyes wandered to the edge of the altar, and he stopped. At the corner of the jade altar table, sat a tiny, lonesome flower.